hierarchical structures are, as far as I'm concerned, inevitable. That doesn't mean they're all good. If you imagine that there's a complex problem that needs to be solved, I think we can all agree that there are complex problems that need to be solved. And then imagine that we have to solve them cooperatively and competitively. So we organize ourselves into groups. And then if we're aimed at solving the problem, what we try to do is organize ourselves into a hierarchy so the people who are most competent at solving the problem rise to the top of the hierarchy. And then maybe we set up reward structures so that we incentivize them to the degree that's possible to extract out the maximum value from their competence. Now, the problem with that is that hierarchies, once set up, even if they're set up to solve problems, can become corrupt. And they can be dominated by people who are only after power and who will exploit the resources of the hierarchy. And we have to be always awake to that. That's the ever-present danger of tyranny at every level of bureaucratic organization. And that can happen within a capitalist system just like every other system. But the inequality problem is much deeper, because when you structure a hierarchy, you get winners and you get losers, and that can get really steep. So the winners take all and the losers have nothing. Now, a complex society has a variety of ways of dealing with that. It sets up multiple hierarchies, for example, so that if you fail in one, you might be able to succeed in another. It tries to make the hierarchies open so that if you are competent, you have the possibility of rising. And that's one of the things that can take the edge off the inequality. Like one of the reasons that Americans have been able to deal with inequality quite appropriately throughout their entire history is that those at the bottom believed that with sufficient sacrifice, they had some probability, even if it was a multi-generational probability, of moving up the ladder. And it's the loss of that, it's the loss of hope that I think is even more important than the rising inequality. Now, with regards to seismic shifts, it's like, well, that to me, it's like, okay, fair enough, but seismic shifts are dangerous. And what makes you think that you know what seismic shifts are going to repair inequality? Because inequality is very, very difficult to deal with. This is one of the things that annoys me about the Marxists, is that they blame inequality on capitalism. And inequality has its terrible consequences. It puts people at zero, where it's hard for them to get moving. You know, and it can destabilize societies if it becomes steep enough. But the idea that that's something that's unique to capitalism there's no evidence for that whatsoever. There's less inequality, statistically speaking, in the European countries, you know, I'm including North America and Australia and that, than there is in the non-European countries. Inequality is very difficult to get rid of, and we don't know how to do it. All systems we know of produce hierarchies of inequality, but very few also produce wealth.
Yes.
And capitalism at least produces wealth, and a fair bit of that goes to the poorest people. So, for example, between the year 2000 and the year 2012, the number of people in the world in abject poverty fell by 50%. And by UN current projections, there won't be anybody living underneath the abject poverty mark by the year 2030. So despite the fact that inequality is growing in the way that we just described, absolute wealth is growing as well, and a fair bit of that is lifting up the poorest people in the world to the point where they might be able to start to actually get away from zero and to have a life. And that's a big deal.
Well, even in socialistic settings, philosophies, you still have a hierarchical issue,
yeah.
Right? So what makes those so alluring to some folks? What's the promise that people see there?
No one likes the negative consequences of hierarchical structures, especially when they start to become corrupted by power seeking. You know, if you walk down the street, if you're a well-off person, you walk down the streets of Manhattan and you see a ruined, alcoholic, homeless person on the street, it's not like you're dancing in delight because you're in your position and he's in his. It's painful, you know, and you think, well, wouldn't it be lovely if our system could be set up so that that kind of suffering could be alleviated by adjustments to the social structure? And that's associated with compassion, which is a fundamental trait. And it's an egalitarian trait. And it characterizes, for example, it's one of the predictors of politically correct belief, is compassion. And the idea that, well, we should equalize things so that everybody has a fair shake and maybe even a fair outcome.
But how did humans historically deal with this? I mean, these hierarchical structures do become unstable after a while, whether it's because of capitalism or socialism or communism. Whatever the cause of it is, any group of humans working together has it. So what's to solve? What role, for example, has faith placed in widening that hierarchy so more people have flexibility?
Well, what we hope is that we solve it through negotiation. And that's another issue that's relevant to free speech. It's not like the billionaires, it's not like the American billionaires are sitting at home with their mattress stuffed with money first. Their money is out there in the world doing all sorts of things. And there's many of them who are banding together for all sorts of philanthropic purposes. And I would say that one of the things that has to be built into capitalism is this notion of a higher moral purpose. It's like, well, it isn't how much money you have. It's what you decide to do with it. And that money opens up the possibility of solving, possibly, of addressing at least very, very complex problems for everyone. And so the money can be used wisely. I would say that what you have if you're rich is not so much a responsibility to flatten the economic distribution as it is to use your money in the most appropriate possible way to alleviate the problems that disturb your conscience about the structure of the world. You have to do that carefully. So let's say along with the wealth comes an attendant responsibility. We criticize the wealthy because we think, at least in part, of their excessive lifestyle, let's say, their excessive reliance on luxury and
decadence.
And decadence, yeah. And that characterizes a certain proportion of rich people, but also a certain proportion of middle class and poor people. It's not a sin that's unique to the rich, but what's required of the rich in a in a society that's functioning appropriately morally is that they use their money wisely. That's the responsibility that goes along with having that access to that power.
Why is it not happening now? The numbers that I just quoted to you reveal the opposite is happening. That it's seemingly, anyway, more of the fruits of capitalism's benefit are accruing to the wealthiest Americans.
Yeah, well,
so people who don't have that money are getting appropriately, understandably angry.
Well, afraid too.
Afraid.
Yeah.
And stress is a rich man's word for fear.
Yes.
So.
Well, there is some good news on the horizon. I mean, unemployment rates have been falling quite nicely, and there is some evidence that wages are increasing.
Independent of what's naturally happening.
Yes.
If people who have a lot can make a lot more easily than people don't have a lot.
Yeah.
What is the structural solution? What does the next generation of advance look like in capitalism?
I don't know. The hierarchical problem. This is why the Marxists bother me. Part of it. The problem of hierarchical inequality is unbelievably deep. I mean, people are really different, and people range unbelievably widely in their talents. And the consequence of that is in a social environment that you get incredible disparity no matter where you look. The dialogue between the left and the right is a continual attempt to solve that problem. Because the right says, look, we need these hierarchies, and here's why they're functional and why they're efficient, and we need to reward the people who are able and willing and competent and conscientious. And the left says, yeah, but don't forget, these structures ossify, they become blind, and they start to serve the interests of power. And then they leave people who have something to contribute on the bottom, and that's to no one's benefit. And both those positions are correct, and sometimes one is more correct than the other, depending on the historical point that we're in. You need a constant dialogue between the reasonable right and the reasonable left so that you can figure out how to maintain the hierarchies so that they continue to perform their necessary functions, and at the same time distribute the resources in a way that enable people who are at the bottom to have, well, let's say to have optimal equality of opportunity. And everyone wants that, because you also want to be able to benefit from the talent pool that's isolated at the bottom of the hierarchy at zero and can't rise up, because all of those additional people could be adding useful, what would you say? They could be adding use of various sorts to the world. But I think it's a political issue, and I think the dialogue between the right and the left, that's really what it focuses on. Two things. It focuses on that inequality, and it focuses on borders. But it isn't obvious how to rectify inequality. And to say that it's due to capitalism and its flaws, it's like, well, yes, but it's a way deeper problem than that. And we've tried solutions. We've tried to radically egalitarianize societies. You know, the Soviets tried that, then the Maoists tried that, and it was just an absolute bloody disaster. And there's a certain amount of inequality that everyone is going to have to live with, because we all come into the world with different talents and abilities. And we actually want that. So it's an unbelievably tricky question. But again, I would say, from my perspective, the best way to address that is to put your own house in order. That means morally, means financially, to use your money wisely, not to use it to chase impulsive and reprehensible pleasures. It's also something that does your reputation no good and destabilizes society, because it makes the rich look like parasites. And some people are parasitical, but many aren't. And we don't want to destabilize. We don't want to put a situation in place where people have their faith in the entire economic system destabilized, because then they will look for those radical solutions. And I don't see any evidence that radical solutions produce anything but a lot of unnecessary misery.